Pemulwuy was a warrior who almost brought the early settlement at Sydney Cove to its knees, and for the survival of the colony, a price was put on his head. For 200 years, this resistance fighter and his 12-year war against the British colony were written out of history. But now there's pressure to find Pemulwuy's remains and restore his reputation. Over the next 2 weeks, I hope you enjoy Pemulwuy, A War of Two Laws.
Well, Pemulwuy is clearly one of the first people we know about who actively resisted white settlement. We know that he caused the government a great deal of concern. He was listed as an outlaw. There was a price put on his head. So perhaps as the first in the Sydney region, he has special importance.
The important thing that I want people to know is that, you know, the surrounding tribes, they united because of Pemulwuy. They united because they knew that they had a strong leader and they knew that they had someone that was going to die for them if that needed be.
Pemulwuy was a Bidjigal man. Bembul means earth. He had that as a child. When he grew to be a man, he became Pemulwuyan, the earth and crow. And that's what his name represents, the earth and the crow.
Whatever anyone else could do, Pemulwuy did it better. He could run further. Was one of the best. He could use a spear like no one else could. And so around him was created an aura of difference. So much so that he was said to be a clever man.
Yeah, he was a Karachi man. He was a real lawman. He was a well-trained doctor. Not so much a witch doctor, but a doctor. You know, Aboriginal people had forms of heart massage too. You know, they lived for a long time. And let's remember, people, let's get this serious and straight to the fact. We were running as fast as emus. The truth about Pemulwuy is that Pemulwuyan, he lived amongst the British of the colony for 2 years. He was probably the first diplomat, apart from Bennelong.
Bennelong seemed to get on pretty well with the British. But Pemulwuy didn't. So then I tracked back to find why he didn't like him. The next thing I found is that he was trading meat with them because at that stage, the British colony in Sydney was pretty short of meat. And Pemulwuy's people were very good hunters. And he would trade meat for them, for other things, but the trade broke down.
There were certainly hostilities by the Europeans against the Aboriginal people which caused retaliation, no question about that. But there was also the removal of food resources. If you have Aboriginal people netting with a small net or catching fish with a hook and line, then you remove a small proportion of the fish from an area. The Europeans had large seine nets and they removed all the fish from a bay.
All the land around the harbour of Tubergal, they put fences on it and made it theirs. And they did the same around Botany Bay or Kamei. They did it right up the Georges River, the Parramatta River, right out as far as the Hawkesbury. And Pemulwuy watched them do it. I mean, you'd have to be blind Freddy not to know what the British were up to. And he saw what they did. He saw them making these things called farms. And he saw the way they worked them.
When the first farms were established along the Hawkesbury River, they dug out the yam beds, and the yam beds were the staples of the local people along that part of the river. So they were immediately forced to try to find other sources of food, and when they took the crops, the potatoes and the corn that the settlers were growing, they were seen as stealing what was Europeans' food, and indeed it was Europeans' food. It wasn't theft from the point of view of the Darug people, it was simply taking a new food resource which was growing on what had been their traditional land.
Pemulwuy lived amongst them for 2 years. One day he was hunting, coming back with roo and more cray emu. He's coming back into the colony and he found these tracks. You know, he followed these tracks. These tracks were made by Tillmouth and McIntyre.
McIntyre was certainly killing Aborigines as he was going out hunting. If the Pemulwuy people, the Bidjigal, found bodies of their relatives, they would know who the killer was. And it's fairly clear that there was a responsibility on Pemulwuy for payback. He had to pay back against the British for those who had killed his countrymen.
So McIntyre was central to this. McIntyre was probably a crooked provisioner. Probably most provisioners have been crooked, so McIntyre was nothing special. It was just that he took on Pemulwuy, and he believed he could deal with Pemulwuy by intimidation. But with Pemulwuy it didn't work. So he went out there, armed himself, and with armed New South Wales Corps soldiers with him. And it's reported, he put his gun down on the ground and told Pemulwuy to do likewise, to both disarm and let's talk. So Pemulwuy dropped his spears. McIntyre picked up the gun and tried to shoot Pemulwuy, but imagine to stand in front of Pemulwuy with a spear in his hand and think you're going to shoot him before he can stick it in you. And of course he killed McIntyre.
He did that by spearing McIntyre with a death spear, which was armed with 2 rows of barbs, stone barbs. And the idea of the death spear was that when the person was speared, when the spear shaft came out, the stones would stay inside. So they'd break off and stay inside. And then, of course, over a period of time, the person who'd been speared would die.
They left the community. Pemulwuy left, had nothing more to do with the white people and declared war on them. And what a war it was.
Following the death of McIntyre, following that spearing, he was involved in a number of attacks on farmers across his traditional country. Not only his own clan, not only the Bidjigal people, but he was also leading other people from Liverpool, from Prospect Hill, and probably the South Creek people as well, leading them in attacks against European settlement, basically trying to drive them off his land.
With simple spears, rocks, boomerangs, stones, he defeated the British Army that they sent here. Every single soldier except for Watkin Tench that they sent in pursuit of Pemulwuy either walked back into the community with their saddle over their shoulders or they didn't make it back.
Now, the British were armed with firearms, muskets, and Pemulwuy's people were armed with spears and clubs and shields. So it didn't seem to me they were much of a match for each other. Now, if that was the case, I found it an extraordinary puzzle that he could keep this constant conflict up for 12 years. But then I found the muskets and the spears were not the weapons of that conflict. And on Pemulwuy's side, a remarkable weapon, fire. A weapon that this country had known since humans began here. And Pemulwuy used it as a weapon. And it was that weapon that did 2 things. First of all, it terrorised the British and forced them further and further back towards where they arrived, at the harbour of Chibugal, or Port Jackson as they called it. And the second was, it prevented them feeding themselves. If they tried to grow crops, Pemulwuy burnt them. If they tried to grow animals, cattle, or I suppose sheep, eventually, he killed them and presumably ate them. And so it was a war, a strange sort of war of attrition.
Blackfellas all along the country were coming along taking whatever they wanted. Big cows, sheep, they decimated them, ate the lot. Left the government of the day with, well, the colony of the day, it wasn't a government just yet, but they left the people of the colony starving and on the brink of desolation.
They would sneak up on their enemies. They might light a fire and drive the enemies in a particular direction, they would have a group of people, spears at the ready, to spear the people who came out of huts, for example.
When they speak about guerrilla warfare, he was basically one of the first men to even use it. And we're talking about people from all over the world. Okay, we're referring to that term today. He was one of the very first men to ever use it. You know, tactics of hit and run, hit and run, hit and run. Okay, so his tactics were beyond the British to even combat. He burnt to the ground Tuangabi.
Well, he'd attacked settlements at Toongabbie, and he came into Parramatta with approximately 100 men. It's been suggested that he had 100 men with him. And taunted the soldiers to come and get him. I think it's one of those situations where he felt that he couldn't be harmed. He'd been shot at many times before and had always survived. On this particular occasion, many of his people were killed. There was a contingent of the military in Parramatta, so many of his warriors were killed. He was severely wounded and captured, and that, to a large extent, was the last major attack on a settlement as such. There were later on attacks on farms and isolated shepherds, but it was the last major attack on a settlement.
So he pulled up at Tuangabi, and that's where the resistance started to break down. They shot him in the shoulder, in the back of the neck, in the elbow. They got him with buckshot, with shot all over his body. They took him to Balmain, and they put him in a cell. And they chained him up to his wrist and to his feet and chained him against a wall.
And yet he escaped with the chains still on his ankles. So, of course, that caused his legend to grow, and people then saw him as being invincible.
Then it was all very strange, because rumours started to appear about this man, and many of them written in diaries like Collins' diary and Dawes and so forth, that Pemulwuy and his own people and the British started to believe he couldn't be killed with a musket.
And the fact that he had been wounded and escaped gave him great status amongst his own people. It was believed, for example, that he couldn't be killed by bullets, and so this enhanced his reputation.
He has been known to say that no gun or pistol can kill him. Many shots have been fired at him, and he has now lodged in him, in shot, slugs and bullets, about 8 or 10 ounces of lead. It is supposed he has killed over 30 of our people, but it is doubtful on which side the provocation was given. J.W. Price.
And after that, the whole thing took on a kind of a surrealistic conflict. The British half believed that this guy was some sort of a goblin from the bush, and Pemulwuy encouraged them to think that, because it suited what he was trying to do. And what he was trying to do was get them to go away, someplace else.
The story that we're told from family and as we were kids is that when they had him chained inside the prison cell, there were guards posted out the front, and women sat around the whole building all night singing song. And the story amongst the people was that they absolutely mesmerised and hypnotised the guards, all right? It wasn't a matter of him pulling the brick out of the wall and running away down the street with it. He was injured, okay? It was a matter of them singing, the guards falling asleep, keys being taken and being unlocked and let go.
He recovered from his injuries. He was shot in the head with a shotgun, presumably. He had a number of pellets in his head. But by the end of 1797, he seems to have been fully recovered from them. He was encountered by some Europeans in, I think, November 1797, and continued to lead raids right through until 1802. He was a person who they knew was in fact motivating a lot of other Aboriginal people to raid farms and to attack the settlements. So he was targeted as being the person who they wanted.
Hacking was on a ship and Pemulwuy was walking along the coast, and he said Pemulwuy, after being wounded, all the people believed that he was immune to British bullets. So he'd stand out in front of them, stand right out in front of them and take them on, So just after 12 years, his time ran out. He got his shot and he took it.